Hello, everybody. We're going to get started a few minutes late. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 5th Annual O'Brien Conference, O'Brien Fellowship. My name is Dave Umhafer. I'm the Interim Director of the O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism. We are right next door in Diedrich College of Communication. It's great to see this kind of turnout here today. We are intensely grateful for support from the public and interest in rigorous, fact-based journalism. Feel free to applaud. Thank you. We're grateful as well to Joseph Kearney, the Dean of the Marquette University Law School, and to many of his staff for the use of their wonderful space today. The O'Brien Fellowship was founded in 2013. It supports reporters from Milwaukee and around the country who come to the college, the Diedrich College, to take up residence for 9 months, a full academic year. They take a deep dive into critically important issues and work directly with students who help their research and their investigations. Today we are showcasing the work of one particular fellow, 2016-17 fellow Mark Johnson from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Mark happens to be a Pulitzer Prize winner as well. We'll be featuring his work and the work of his team of students and fellow professionals. Mark's team traveled locally and globally to report on the reasons for the growing threat posed by infectious diseases. Think Zika and yellow fever, Ebola, and more. Before we hear from the journalists, I would like to recognize and thank Nobel Peace Prize winner Jonathan Patz, the director of the UW-Madison Global Health Institute, for being here. We're thrilled to have you. Now I'd like to turn this over to a major advocate for the O'Brien program, the Dean of the College of Communication, Kimo Yoon, for a special presentation.
So those people who have seen me speak before are starting to get tired of me saying this. But I regularly say I have the absolute best job in the world. And because every day I get to wake up, I come into Marquette. Marquette's a special place. I tell people in my ride, it takes me about 15 minutes to get to work every day, and I never miss. Every day I think to myself, what can I do special today? What can I do to make a difference in someone's life? What can I do to make this place better? And that really speaks to what the O'Brien Fellowship Program does. When I think about my job, that job is very easy because we have a phenomenal program that exists no place else in the country that puts together journalism and students and mentorship and opportunities and job training and skills and helping them to build portfolios. There's no one else who's able to do that and say they do that in the country, and that makes us very proud. Day one I got here, I told everyone I put the student in the center, and it's all about the student experience. When you do that well, everything else is going to fall in line. And as the result, programs like this and other programs really are going to excel. The origin of this program happened with George Stanley. Where's George? George is here somewhere. George Stanley had an idea, and he and then Dean Bergen talked about a concept of wanting to put together a fellowship program. That's the easy part. I sit in my office all day, and I have ideas. We can all do that. They had an idea, but they had no mechanism to be able to fund the idea. And so an idea like that doesn't launch unless you also have a partner who comes along at the same time, who shares the same values, and who say, this is something something I want to support, that I want to put my resources behind. And in stepped Pete and Pat Frechette. And Pat's parents, Alicia and Perry, were graduates of Marquette, and they wanted to do something special for them, and hence the origin of the O'Brien Fellowship Program. They said, let's combine all of the values of Marquette with all of our values to put something together. And this program has really taken off. When we talk about the reach, millions of people have been touched as a result of this program. We are fortunate this year to have Pete and Pat's daughters here, Kathy and Christy, with us, and they're sitting right in the middle. Thank you for being here. And last year, unfortunately, just a year from now, we lost Pat, and we put together a video tribute, and we dedicated the fellowship conference to Pat. And since then, we've also lost Pete, and we are sorry for your loss because they gave so much. But we thought it only fitting again to, in their honor, in their memory, dedicate this conference to them as well. And we updated our video, and so we also wanted to show a little bit of video about the impact of this program. So what public service journalism means to me, it means that how do I investigate a story? In the Dietrich College of Communication, we talk about using communication for the greater good. That's exactly what the O'Brien Fellowship Program is. It's about investigating stories that otherwise might not have ever received attention. It's about thinking about ways how we change things. When we see something's wrong, how do we go out there and investigate it to say, how do we make it right? It's about making a difference in the world.
The Frischettes are this wonderful couple. We're just a delight to be around. They're the type of people that just being in their presence lifts you up. They always would say, this is our favorite thing. Of all the things we've done, this is our favorite. Pat used to say it in this real gentle way, and pat me. And Pete was this ball of fire and energy who got things done. And Pete wasn't going to let us skate, and he wasn't going to let us come up with some program that wasn't as good as we could possibly make it. He was a demanding guy, but he was also just a great guy.
It helps me as a teacher so I can point to and bring in the O'Brien Fellows and say to my freshmen, this is the standard to which you should strive to meet, right? O'Brien Fellowship is one of the things that distinguishes our journalism program. We offer opportunities nobody else does for our students, and we couldn't do that without the Frischettes, their gifts, and the O'Brien Fellowships.
Without the O'Brien Fellowship, I don't know where I would be. Being able to work on those long-term investigative projects, it really solidified that journalism is where I wanted to be. And both summers that I was in graduate school, I got to return to the Journal-Sentinel for an internship. And those two experiences were unimaginable and showed me the kind of work that I was capable of doing and showed me what life as a reporter would be like.
We really got involved for a couple of reasons. Pat's parents were both graduates of Marquette University. Honoring their memory with something like this was something we wanted to do. But probably more importantly, we really thought the program was innovative and exciting from the perspective that you know, newspapers are having problems, news and how it's delivered is changing.
When college is so very, very expensive and finding a job is difficult. And this prepares them, as far as I'm concerned, to walk right on out and be able to find a job anywhere.
We think that investigative journalism could use a boost, and this is a real opportunity.
Well, I think one of the things that makes this gift so special is that it's going to keep on giving. It keeps multiplying. All the good it does, this solutions-based public service journalism, how we solve problems in America, it just keeps going and going and going.
I was immediately struck, as everybody is, I think, by Pete Frischette's sort of command-bearing former military officer, and Pat Frischette, who was a teacher. She has that way of kind of looking at you and communicating strongly with just a few words and a look. But they really made it clear that they wanted you to do your best journalism. And when you left that conversation, you felt like I really need to step up and honor the gift that they gave and make this the best work of my life.
The other great thing about being the dean is I get a microphone. And what they left on the cutting room floor, what talked about there is I said, the great thing about this gift is 20, 30, 50 years from now, I'm not going to be around. Many of us won't be around. But this gift will be here and keep giving. And that's, for me, the power of it. It is going to outlast everyone in this room. And it will forever leave a mark on investigative journalism. A key component of this program are our students, getting our students engaged. And I would like to ask McKenna Oxenden up here. McKenna is going to introduce Mark Johnson. McKenna is a student, a journalism student who is a senior. She worked with Mark Johnson in this program. She's currently working with Aaron Rodgers in this program. She's committed to our student media program. She is very active and is someone who is a real mover and also looking for a job. So should you have a job available for her, I can connect you with her. So McKenna, please come up.
So the first thing I remember Mark Johnson telling me is, don't worry, I don't really know what I'm doing either. It's fine. I was already terrified to start working on this project, and now the person in charge of me was saying that all of us students were on the same playing field. Okay, Mark, whatever you say. I could recite Mark Johnson's resume to you. I could tell you about his Pulitzer, how he's worked at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel for 17 years, and before that, he worked at the Providence Journal-Bulletin, where he was a reporter and bureau manager for 4 years. Or I could tell you about who Mark really is and what it's like to be one of his assistants. It was never an option for him to look at us like we were just a student. It's who he is. He's the world's most pessimistic person about himself. He would beat himself up about that sentence he wrote that he absolutely hated, and that one question that he forgot to ask during the interview. But you would show him the lead you wrote, and by lead I mean the 500-word blurb you write, because that's how Mark rolls. And he would be your biggest cheerleader. He'd practically get out those pom-poms telling you how good you were, and he'd tell you that it was the greatest thing he'd ever read. And that was before he'd carefully launch into how he might change it. And on a day when you were feeling like you were the least employable person in the universe, he'd be the first to confidently tell you that, don't worry, you're going to be at the New York Times. I think what sets Mark apart is his compassion for what he does and who he works with. And the dad jokes. We cannot forget about the dad jokes. But whether it was a really bad day or it was Thirsty Thursday, Mark was the first one to be our concerned Marquette dad and make sure we were okay and that we were going to be safe wherever we were going. Mark was able to earn the trust of sources after sources, from scientists to locals in Uganda and Brazil, for his stories. And only a few times did he have to pull I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist card, something he absolutely hated doing. Coming to O'Brien, I knew I'd come out a better journalist. What I didn't know was that I'd be coming out with both a mentor in life and journalism, a friend that not only gives great advice but also listens, and someone to look up to. So please welcome Mark Johnson.
Thanks so much for that introduction, McKenna. I'm speechless for once. Dave, did we want to show this first, or do you want me to talk? You can do the trailer. Okay. I think we're going to show you, just introduce you to the project a little bit. This is a trailer that the graphics and digital designers came up with. It's pretty good. We have a complex relationship with animals. We eat them, we keep them as pets, we fear them and love them. And on this planet we share, our decisions bring us into closer contact with them. That contact drives a darker aspect of our relationship, the diseases we share with animals. HIV, rabies, Ebola, Zika. Known as zoonotic diseases, they account for more than 60% of of the 400 or so emerging infectious illnesses identified since 1940. Each year, the diseases cause 2.5 billion cases of illness worldwide and 2.7 million deaths. They've cost us more than $20 billion over the last decade. Our own choices are increasing the threat. Once distant diseases are now a plane ride away. The forests we clear force wildlife into our cities and towns, carrying Lyme disease and rabies. We want to get places quickly without cutting our use of fossil fuels, and the mosquitoes that carry Zika, dengue, and yellow fever flourish. They're more active, have more offspring, and bite more frequently in the resulting climate. Our next choice may be the most important. How do we respond?
First of all, thank you all for being here. I hope you'll find the discussions today eye-opening and the work of the students you'll be hearing from today inspiring. I know I've been inspired by their work on a daily basis. They're so far ahead of where I was when I was a college journalist 30-odd years ago. I hope you'll indulge me a little at first because I really need to thank some people for this amazing experience. As I said, I've been a journalist for 30 years and I've never had a year quite like this. First of all, Marquette, which became much more of a home than I'd ever imagined after 30 years in the newsroom. I'd like to thank the Freshettes, whose support of the O'Brien Fellowship has allowed it to become something truly unique in journalism, a true collaboration of college and media, students and professional journalists. I also like to thank the O'Brien staff who were very, very patient with my disorganization and were incredibly good at translating receipts from Uganda and Kenya into dollars and actually also into expense forms that were readable, since mine were not. Also like to thank the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, also provided valuable funding and support for the trips to Uganda and Kenya and Brazil. Also, I have to thank my newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, which has shown a really deep commitment to public service reporting, the kind of work that takes time and is becoming critically endangered at media organizations around the world and especially across the country. Special thanks to the paper's editor, George Stanley, who has been the driving force in making ambitious work at the Journal-Sentinel's franchise, something that's embedded in our DNA. The stories we're going to talk about today would not have come about without George and without Greg Borowski, the Journal-Sentinel's deputy editor for news, projects, and investigations. Their fingerprints are on all of the stories, basically all of the project online and in print. The project also benefited a great deal from the paper's award-winning graphics editors and web designers who made some very long stories easier to read and more insightful. Finally, I want to thank the Outbreak team, photographer Mark Hoffman and students McKenna Oxenden, Ryan Patterson, and Davey Shastri. Anything that has succeeded in this project has succeeded because of their hard work. Really, honestly, I didn't know what to expect in terms of working with students. I guess I was thinking a bit back to what I was like as a student at University of Toronto, and I wouldn't have been in the same league as these guys. They were just terrific. A little bit about our project. You may be wondering why I picked this. It doesn't sound terribly local. When the public thinks of zoonotic diseases, those that go from animals to people, they tend to think of Ebola, bird flu, plague, illnesses that come from faraway places, the poultry markets of Asia, the forests and jungles of Uganda and Brazil, slums of large cities like Nairobi in Kenya. But what got me curious about the subject in the beginning was the death of a much-loved orangutan at the Milwaukee County Zoo, the famous Mahal, a victim close to home with a pathogen that had traveled a very long way, both in time and distance, to reach Milwaukee. Tony Goldberg, the University of Wisconsin researcher who investigated Mahal's death, told me that he goes to a field station in Uganda twice a year to learn about new and emerging diseases. But he also finds them in the fish, mink, birds, and other wildlife in Wisconsin. In other words, these diseases aren't just Africa's problem or Asia's or South America's. They're our problem too. That's the one message I think I'd love for you to take home today. Now more than ever before, a virus that brews thousands of miles away can reach the US in a day, even less. That means that we can't think of borders when we think of diseases. We can't pretend to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Infectious diseases, antibiotic resistance, those kinds of challenges, they're challenges to all mankind, or all humankind, I should say. Jonathan Quick, the author of a book that'll be coming out in January called The End of Epidemics, pointed out that there are really only 4 things that can have a catastrophic effect on humans: an asteroid striking the Earth, nuclear war, climate change, and pandemic influenza. That's how important the decisions that we make are. Many of the scientists that I've spoken to have emphasized that one of the most effective ways of protecting our country from disease outbreaks is to help improve health care in the poorer countries where a lot of these diseases are emerging. That means thinking beyond our borders, training healthcare workers in other countries, as the CDC has been doing in places like Madagascar now, which I believe has a plague outbreak. That means also basically teaching them to use the latest technology to respond to outbreaks, to search for the sick, to find and treat them before they ever board a plane to the US or any other country. It's not a simple situation. It's complicated, and that's what makes it a good story, in my view. So again, thanks to all of you for coming. Please enjoy and participate in the discussions. I hope you'll find them eye-opening. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Doctor. Sorry. I'm so honored to be able to introduce Dr. Jonathan Patz, Director of the Global Health Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an integral member of the organization that shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Patz has served as a lead author for that organization, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. Not surprisingly, when I was working on a story for this project about climate change and infectious disease, this was the story we went to Brazil for, and basically talked to people about the yellow fever outbreak they were having. When I talked to people about this subject, again and again, people started off, the first thing they told me was, well, have you talked to Jonathan Patz? At UW, Dr. Patz is the John P. Holton Chair in Health and the Environment, with appointments in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies and the Department of Population Health Sciences. Change, a report mandated by the U.S. He also has testified before both houses of the U.S. Congress and has served on several scientific committees of the National Academy of Sciences. He's written over 90 peer-reviewed scientific papers, which is a phenomenal amount, and they're in many of the top, most difficult journals to get papers in. He's also written a textbook addressing the health effects of global environmental change and co-edited the 5-volume Encyclopedia of Environmental Health. He most recently co-edited Climate Change and Public Health in Oxford University Press, and is leading a massive online open course called Climate Change, Policy, and Public Health. And on top of it all, Dr. Patz is a double board certified doctor in occupational environmental medicine and family medicine. He received his medical degree from Case Western Reserve University in 1987 and his Master of Public Health degree from Johns Hopkins. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Patz.
Mark, that was very kind. Thank you.
So I'd like to start off by acknowledging that although perhaps there shouldn't be, there is still a quote-unquote controversy surrounding climate change. What would you tell people here who are still either on the fence or doubting? What is the most compelling evidence proving that climate change is real and that humans have accelerated it?
Well, Mark, if I was in any other country in the world, I would not get that question. And in fact, as far as scientists that are studying climate change, you've heard the 97% that are fully in agreement that, one, that climate change is happening, and two, that it is from human activity, especially burning fossil fuels. Even those studies about the 97% have been reconfirmed by the National Academy of Sciences. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change of the UN, that represents the best climate centers in the world, and most recently, they have shown that with very high confidence, again, climate change is happening, and it's from burning fossil fuels and cutting the rainforest, the CO2 sink. So I would say to someone, look, number one, I'm a health scientist working with climate scientists, and even if I was a climatologist, I'd say, go to the IPCC and look at the evidence that they show. Those are, most of the climate scientists working on this. And just Friday, the U.S. National Assessment on Climate Change was released, again confirming that they are unable to find any alternative evidence for climate change other than burning fossil fuels. So there's no scientific debate. And that's the key thing. It's not a scientific debate anymore. There are many non-scientists. This questioning comes from non-scientists that think we're still in the days where we use punch cards and the largest computer drive is a 40 megabyte drive. We have come a long way, and the climate scientists are more and more certain about it.
If you track their predictions, too, aren't we arriving at a lot of those predictions earlier than even they had expected?
That's the other key message, is that climate change is not off in the future. We are already seeing an increase in the frequency of extreme events. As the sea surface temperature is warming, we are seeing more frequent Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. Not necessarily more landfall, hitting landfall, but when storms form, they're stronger. The climate scientists say it's hard to pin blame attribution on climate change of any single event, but the mega fire in California that destroyed 7,000 houses, you talk to the climate fire modelers and they say, well, that's consistent with extremes of the water cycle. More flooding and buildup of fuel, and then extreme drought, that's consistent. The heat wave in Europe that killed over 50,000 people in 11 days, you can't blame that on climate change, but the climate scientists say the probability of that event happening has been increased by 5 to 10-fold for the current greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So the probabilities are increasing. We are seeing these happening now.
Now, you brought up a number of the things that people are most familiar with as consequences of climate change: rising sea levels, also increasing heat. But infectious diseases and their effect on infectious diseases, I think, get less attention. So can you tell us, why does climate change affect infectious diseases? How does it affect it?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and now one reason that I've been studying this myself for more than 20 years is because when you look at those physical attributes of climate change, rising temperatures, sea level rise, extremes of the hydrologic cycle, the water cycle, so more extreme droughts, floods, and fires, all of those affect health through multiple pathways, certainly directly through heat waves, air quality, malnutrition, forced environmental refugees. But the infectious disease aspect is because of the sensitivity, the climate sensitivity of many diseases. Let me ask the audience a question. You know, what's the difference between us mammals and insects, besides the fact that we don't fly? And Dave reassured me that most all of you don't suck blood. So, I mean, we are warm-blooded. Our body temperature is always more or less the same. An insect, a mosquito that could carry diseases, that's a cold-blooded animal. Reptiles and insects are cold-blooded. So whatever the air temperature is, that's the body temperature of the mosquito. And if that mosquito, let's say it's Aedes aegypti mosquito that carries yellow fever, dengue fever, and Zika virus, if the temperature goes up, the viral replication rate goes up, and mosquito and biting rates go up. So that when we think about the difference between winter and summer temperatures in Wisconsin, and we say, well, what's 1 degree? Who cares about 1 or 2 degrees? It's really important in these biologic systems that involve insect vectors, the insect vectors that carry diseases. So I've seen some explanations of climate change that the greatest threat may be the smallest,
right.
And they're talking about insect-borne diseases.
Yeah, hasn't I believe the Asian tiger mosquito is one of the examples people go to again and again. In I think 30 years, hasn't it spread like enormously? I mean, to parts of Europe where I think it hadn't been in Europe at all 30 years ago. Let's look more at zoonotic diseases, and what does climate change do to animals in general in terms of their location? What happens?
Yeah, well, so with climate change, of course, you're going to be shifting habitats, and that could mean the movement of reservoir hosts or intermediate hosts that carry disease, as well as their vectors. So take, for example, the Lone Star tick has been identified as moving northward into Wisconsin, as one example. The range of the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus, which can overwinter, that's been heading north. So there has been documentation of in the northern hemisphere, northward movement of some of these vectors. But of course, climate change should not be viewed in isolation. What we do to the landscape is very important as well, so that we need to be thinking about land use change and ecological change, how that may shift biodiversity or may change, for example, for Lyme disease. If you ask me what's more important, land use or climate change, I'd say it's really complicated in a 2-year cycle, and I'd say probably land use change. But But that's a really tough question.
When we talk about land use changes, give us some examples.
Well, I'll give you one example that's not from here, which is something that we studied in the Peruvian Amazon, where we found a direct relationship between the increased risk of malaria with deforestation. Controlling for human population density, we were able to show that the increased frequency of biting of the particular Anopheles darling-eye mosquito that carries malaria in that region increased with deforestation. We're not exactly sure why that happens. There are some ecological explanations. It may be with the aquatic ecosystem and temporary pools of water rather than established biodiverse, rich pools of water where there are lots of things that eat mosquito larvae. We're not exactly sure, but we found relationships between deforestation and malaria risk.
I was fascinated by something that you mentioned to me in an email. You said that it's not just the movements of animals, but it's human migration too that's affected by climate change. That we don't hear as much about, but I think you mentioned Syria.
Yeah, so this is a really important point. I'm always asked, will we see more of these diseases move into the United States? The first thing is that many of the mosquitoes that carry dengue fever and Zika virus, they're already here. The mosquitoes are here. It's a matter of human population movement bringing the virus. So it's really important to look at these different aspects. You need both the insect vector, but it's already here, but you also need population movement. Now, Syria is interesting because, to be honest with you, when we look at any single disease related to climate change, I think it's a very fragmented, narrow focus when you say, well, what's more important? Climate's influence on that disease or some other influence on that disease. And I would say the issue about climate change is it's not a single exposure, dose-response thing. And that some of the indirect effects of climate change could be the most drastic. Now, Syria. A paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that just before the Syrian civil war, they experienced the worst drought in the instrumental record. Rural to urban migration rates were documented to be 4 or 5 times higher than normal. There were food price shocks and people rioting in the streets. So these types of destabilizing situations, extreme climatic situations that then put a strain on natural resources and food supplies, I think that those are very scary. Impossible to study, to disentangle, that drought effect versus political strife. The same thing happened in North Korea during the famine. Was it the famine, was it the drought, or was it the inflexibility of the North Korean government? They're very tricky. But this is what sort of keeps me up at night when we think about how big these indirect effects of a changing climate regime could be.
I mean, all of a sudden, I'm imagining as you're talking that a resource that we so take for granted, water, could be, the source of, war between countries, basically, if we begin experiencing shortages of it, something that most of us here in this country have never, have not experienced. Although California had its drought a couple of years ago.
Right. I'm going to use your bringing up water to add on another thing about infectious diseases, because the most sensitive diseases to climate change are vector-borne diseases, mostly insect and rodent, but mostly insect-borne diseases, and waterborne diseases because of more flooding and contamination. When I co-chaired the first national assessment on climate change, this report to Congress, the sleeper issue, the one that we had no idea was a big problem, was waterborne diseases. In fact, the United States, I think we're a relatively developed country. We can't handle our stormwater very well today. Today, more than 1 trillion gallons of sewage-contaminated stormwater overflows into our lakes and rivers every year.
Wow.
That keep Niagara Falls running for 18 days. And Milwaukee, of course, is a unique place. That cryptosporidiosis epidemic that happened in 1993.
Didn't that have a possible climate component too?
Well, we analyzed that as having the highest precipitation month in the 50-year record that we studied. Now, I was just this morning with Dr. Sandra McClellan, who's at the School of Freshwater Sciences at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and they're monitoring for pathogens in the water, and every time it rains in this area, there are millions of gallons of sewage-contaminated water that comes through the system. And it's one reason why Milwaukee pushed its water intake 1 mile out further into Lake Michigan, because these waterborne diseases, they're a big problem. And with failing infrastructure underground, as far as the drinking water and sewage, this is another really important infectious disease problem.
Is it possible that we see some of these, both waterborne and vector-borne diseases, that, here in the U.S. that we haven't seen in, maybe half a century? Things like, yellow fever. We see malaria very, very rarely. Are those things that doctors are going to have to be prepared to, diagnose in patients?
Well, that's a really tough question, and I think that the way I've been asked that before, and I think that it's impossible to predict whether or not we will see malaria, other than travel-related or airport malaria and things like that. I don't know that it will become established, but what I do know is that the risk will increase, because these are tropical diseases. Malaria cannot develop inside the mosquito unless it's above 15 or 16 degrees centigrade. That's why it's a tropical disease. It's got to have warm enough temperatures. So as temperatures warm across the United States, the risk of these diseases will go up. I think what will happen is we will end up paying more money.
Wow.
And we'll have to, do more to prevent these diseases. So whether or not we'll see more cases depends on our response, and I think that you showed that in your video. I think it will be costing us more.
Can you just quickly, you mentioned airport malaria. Can you explain to people what that is?
Well, we're in a globalized world, so these pathogens can be anywhere in the world in 24 hours in an infected person flying around the world. So one study we did 10 years ago showed that the countries most immediately affected by climate change would be the poor countries that have lots of malnutrition, malaria, diarrheal disease. Yet we're in a globalized world, so an increase in disease anywhere with international travel can show up. And so what you have is someone infected with malaria may land in Miami, and there are mosquitoes that can carry that, and there may be a few cases, once you have, and the parasite shows up, if there are mosquitoes that can pick up the blood and carry it to somebody else, you can have a few cases, but that's airport malaria as opposed to really getting a full-blown
Doesn't it also
epidemic.
involve, can't you get malaria-carrying mosquitoes from other countries that just happen to be aboard a plane or in a shipment or something like that end up at the airport?
Well, I'll go back to the story of West Nile virus, which, based on the genetic fingerprinting of the virus, it looks like it came from the Middle East. It's unknown how it got here. People theorize that it could have been infected mosquitoes in the cargo area, in the cargo hold of the jet. In theory, an immunocompromised person, but it's really unknown how it got here. But interesting, when you couple international travel and climate, I don't say anything. The climate change had nothing to do with West Nile getting here. looks like it was jet travel. But when it arrived in 1999, in July, that was the hottest July ever recorded in New York City. And the American strain of West Nile virus is much more tolerant and, in fact, likes hot temperatures more than the European and African strains. So this is where these dangerous synergies happen, I think.
Sounds kind of like a 1-2 punch. If it arrives at a place where it can establish itself, and temperature is a very important part of disease. So if the temperature is warming and a mosquito arrives from another place, it can at least be here long enough to pass on a disease. Go ahead.
I'll just finish. So I'll make two things. One, also as West Nile traveled across the United States, mostly from birds, bird migratory pathways, Bill Risen, who's a arbovirologist, mosquito-borne virus person, pointed out that the hot spots of transmission were literally hot spots.
Wow.
So when West Nile showed up in the Midwest in 2001 and 2002, predicted to be moving across the country because of the birds. But the places with the most transmission were unseasonably hot. Same thing in the Rockies and in California. So there was a synergy that, yes, it's moving across because of the birds, but the hot spots. And finally, Zika virus. Zika arrived in Brazil. You can track it, it came from the Zika forest in Uganda, 1947, right? You know the history more than me. Coming across the ocean, and then they picked it up in Tahiti. Well, however it got to Brazil, and people speculate either a canoe tournament or the World Cup, international travel is involved, but guess when we had record temperatures across Colombia and Brazil? It was that 2015 El Nino, the strongest in recent history. We've done the climate analysis, and the temperatures were 5 standard deviations above normal, a 50-year record that we looked at. So did that have something to do with it? Looking at the biology of Aedes aegypti mosquito, another paper in the Proceedings of the Academy of Sciences came out showing that right before Zika erupted, the climate-related biological vectorial capacity for transmission of Zika and dengue fever were the highest in the last 60 years.
Wow. So this is the point at which I got to ask you for a little bit of hope. Let's talk about some of the things that would be effective ways to prepare or to deal with this. I mean, I've read a lot of the literature that talks about that maybe thermal screening that's done at some of the airports isn't going to be the solution. Are there things that we as a country can do to at least prepare and maybe prevent this sort of spread of infectious diseases?
Right. Well, there are several things to do at different levels, and of course, in public health, you want to go as far upstream as possible. As far as prevention, I think that the first thing would be to have really good early warning systems for climate. Mm-hmm. So, to the extent that we understand the relationships between extreme climate conditions and disease, we should have great early warning systems for climatic conditions. At the same time, we have been not funding general surveillance for these diseases. So we need to set up these mosquito sentinel sites where they have cages of chickens, and they take blood from the chickens every week to see if the chickens have virus or not. So setting up these sentinel chickens for surveillance, I think, is really important. And then, you can also think about, you don't always want to be mopping up the mess while you don't try to turn off the faucet. And I think this is where there also needs to be attention to what's causing the disruption of the Earth's climate. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's going way upstream and trying to reduce our fossil fuel emissions.
Going back to the concept of trying to have better surveillance, you were talking about. In terms of that, we're not talking just about surveillance in the U.S., right? I mean, we would be talking about having surveillance in, far and wide, right, in other countries.
I think that our best national security in terms of infectious diseases is investment in poor countries all over the world where a lot of these diseases are emerging from. So if we're thinking about, yes, let's just wait till it hits our border and let's put up sentinel things, in the U.S., that would not be wise. We absolutely, I think that you raise a really good point that we need to be thinking strategically about where are the hot spots, and like the wet markets in China and places around the world that where you've got bushmeat hunting and things like that. Absolutely, we need to be moving further upstream, which means out of our country, and looking at where you have these hot spots of transmission. So, for sure.
Great. Now it looks like it might be a good time to take some questions. Anybody? We'll get a mic to you.
Here. All right. There it is. Okay.
Can I give a few instructions? If you're in the lower bowl, raise your hand and we can call on you. When you speak, hit the rim of that little brown thing there and hold it down while you speak. And then we have microphones in the back that are mobile, so take it away.
Yeah, they're really cool microphones.
Right. Okay. In about 2014, I think the authors are Ansolabera and Konzicki, I hope I have their names correct, wrote a book called Cheap and Clean. And they took a look at trends in public opinion in the United States toward fossil fuels and alternative fuels, and also global climate change. And what's interesting in particular about this presentation today is one thing that they recommended is in terms of getting public understanding and sympathy for moving away from fossil fuels and taking a look at alternative sources, is to emphasize the health effects of fossil fuels, both directly and indirectly, through global climate change, is perhaps a better strategy to use than what apparently is now is probably a more diverse kind of approach to it.
Yes, I think this is where we get into talking more about chronic diseases rather than infectious diseases. And I say that because when you think about burning fossil fuels that create greenhouse gases that warm the climate, when you burn oil, coal, and gas, you also emit dirty pollutants like PM 2.5, sulfur dioxide, and the other dangerous pollutants that harm us immediately. According to the Global Burden of Disease and the World Health Organization, 7 million people die every year prematurely from air pollution. According to the World Bank, air pollution costs the world economy more than 5 trillion gallons? More than $5 trillion every year. So, there are immediate health benefits if you were to reduce fossil fuel emissions as a climate change policy, but you have an immediate health benefit. And it's, the argument is, I've seen studies that ask what would it cost to invest in clean energy, like with renewable energy that might be more expensive. Forgetting about subsidies for coal and oil and whatever, forget subsidies, that's a whole other can of worms. But this study showed that, well, it might cost up to $30 for every ton of CO2 that you don't emit from investing in clean energy. But for every ton of CO2 that you don't emit, you're also not emitting the dirty particles and other things that hurt people, such that there'd be a health benefit on average of $200 in avoided mortality and hospitalization. So, you know, decision makers are saying, oh, we don't want to pay the extra money for clean energy, and they're completely ignoring the bigger half of the equation, that if you got to cleaner energy, you would save lots of money and you'd save lots of illness and mortality. You know, the EPA looked at this when they passed the Clean Air Act. They've been required to ask investment costs versus health and environmental benefit. And it's been about $1 investment leads to $30 in benefit. It's the same thing, immediate benefit from fossil fuel reduction.
Wow. There was, I think, another question around here. Yes, please.
Obviously, when you talk about putting money into surveillance, I assume you're talking, well, prior to this last election? And I'm wondering where you see surveillance funding in other countries going under the new president. And then if you push back, if the feds don't do it and the international community can't pick it all up, and it falls to the borders, you know, America first, what's the best steps and what do states and localities have to do? That's really just one question.
Mark, you're the Pulitzer Prize winner.
Well, what I try to do is break things up by parts, because I don't have a big enough brain to take the whole bit. So let's start with the first part. You were the direction now that, you know, I assume the
surveillance was inadequately funded under President Obama and his predecessors. Now you have an administration that doesn't want to fund much of anything outside the borders. So
I would have thought that especially after Ebola, SARS, H1N1, I mean, weren't there bumps in funding for surveillance? I mean, do you remember there being any? I know that at the moment, I mean, Ebola we all know how that dominated the headlines. It was a huge, quote unquote, crisis. And I think if you'd asked people in the middle of that, they would have thrown billions, trillions at it.
Until you get Zika virus that then needed more money, that didn't get more money but took money from Ebola. So I think that this is where I hope that we don't have to just be chasing these disasters and crises and be completely reactionary. I think it's really worth reminding the current administration that it's about national security, that infectious disease outbreaks come from all over the world, and the idea that the zoonotic diseases that are most of the emerging infectious diseases come from all over. You know, it's a matter of reframing, I think. I'd have to talk to a good journalist and talk about reframing the issue as a national security threat, and maybe it would get more funding.
Well, the other thing that it strikes me as kind of a pay me now or pay me later kind of equation, because that money in surveillance, if we don't spend it then and we have an outbreak, we spend a lot more money responding to a disaster like that. I mean, it's comparable to a situation like the wildfires in California. If we don't spend, you know, money on one end, you know, we end up spending a ton on another. I mean, I think for H1N1, if I remember correctly, I think it was in the order of something like $7 billion or something that we spent on, you know, responding to that outbreak. That's a huge amount of money. I would guess that would have gone a long way in terms of surveillance. Just one thing, when we go back to, you were talking about some of the poorer countries. Many of us may not have a solid idea of just how, just what their medical, sort of their health infrastructure is like. Just how far, you know, behind us or
Can you give us sort of a picture of more what they are dealing with?
Well, it's a sad situation that you go to Africa and almost everyone has a cell phone, but they don't have sewage treatment. They don't have clean drinking water. There are places all over the world still are lagging way behind in public health infrastructure. So, we have made progress. There are many diseases we're close to eradicating polio. Let's cross your fingers that extreme hydrologic extremes and more rainfall and more stormwater sewage doesn't make it more challenging to get rid of polio, which it will, but we're almost there. We have reduced malaria. We've made many great gains, but the lacking infrastructure, especially in public health, is still, it's a shame that we cannot move faster as far as public health infrastructure.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Dr. Joseph Bionanebie. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Sciences here at Marquette. And I was born in Uganda. I was part of the National Outbreaks Task Force that responded to Ebola and anthrax 2010-2012. I want, first of all, say a word of appreciation. There is a lot of work that is being done out there in the developing world. It's about CDC, it's about USAID in predicting and responding to those diseases. We must first appreciate. So my question to you, some of the climate adaptation strategies that we are talking about seem to be macro at a higher level. What can we do at a lower level as individuals, as students, as people who are interested in publishing information? Because I feel like everything's at a higher level, Maybe you could give some thought.
So thank you for asking that excellent question. And the way you prefaced your first part of that question, I think, is the answer, which is that, in fact, we have much more to learn from developing countries and how they deal with day-to-day and annual crises, especially around climate adaptation. We have more to learn from countries under stress and dealing with these disasters than we actually understand. So there has to be a very healthy bi-directional flow of information, number one. And, that's where, and also tapping into traditional knowledge. And I mean, Native American, First Nations, and traditional knowledge around the world is something where people have been living with the environment and having a closer relationship to the environment than many of us in the industrialized world. And I think there are lessons there, major lessons. So it's got to be a very bi-directional engagement. We'll have the most learning. And the adaptation strategies are all, there are many of them, they're all over the place. Number one, though, is that we need to bridge the divide between ministries and different sectors. That's one of the most important things that can happen anywhere in the world, including our own country, that the Ministry of Environment is talking with the Ministry of Finance, which is talking to the Ministry of Health. And not fighting over the same financial resources, that in fact, you take one step forward in development and if you're too narrow in your development, you've just caused more problems than you've solved, right? So it's got to be a much better coordinated approach. And there's something very important in the World Health Organization they've been pushing, which is called a health in all policies approach, to make sure that all sectors are involved. When you design a neighborhood or design a city, be in touch with people working in health and environment. and in water and sewage, and recognize that if you build impervious surfaces, you're going to worsen your stormwater, or you're going to worsen your urban heat island effect, or you're going to design cities for motorized vehicles and design daily exercise out of existence, you know? So, you know, this health in all policies approach is another important way.
Any other questions? Anybody? Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a non-partisan group trying to reduce the amount of fossil fuels, trying to contact Congress about getting onto solutions, and there is now in the House a caucus group, which when we started out about a year or so ago, there were only 14 members. The caucus has to be bipartisan, one Democrat, one Republican. At this year, there are 60 members, and they're trying to work on a carbon tax or fee and dividend. And what we can do is we can contact our Congress people and tell them to get on board to this committee. And they better do it fast, because we need that kind of activity. We were just at a conference with a professor from the University of Chicago who told a story about how London, and when you mentioned the Great Lakes, our Lake Michigan and sewage being dumped, well, she mentioned that in London, a couple of centuries ago, they had so much human waste that the Thames River, it was going down the Thames, and the Thames River had 3 feet of this stuff on the side. So she said they had to figure something out. Well, she said carbon is our current waste, and we've got to figure out how to do this. So that's all I have to say.
You know, let me make a comment about that. It's a good point. And think about, when did smoking rates in youth, when did we have a fall in smoking rates? It was when we put a higher price on cigarettes. Very well documented. And what a lot of people don't understand is that climate change is a public health crisis. It's not just about the polar bears. It is, for many reasons, it is a public health crisis. So, like tobacco, there needs to be a price on carbon. And unfortunately, just like the tobacco industry, there is a lot of disinformation abound all over that is trying to sow doubt on the climate science, which is why we need great journalists and all the students, that are going to help counter that disinformation campaign. That's your job now.
You, as you were talking, I was just wondering,
We have time for about 30 more seconds. Yeah.
Okay, real quick question. Are there any examples of countries that have made this leap, have gone beyond denial, and are now in a transformative stage doing some of the things that would help?
I will shift your question to say not just countries, but places. And right now, with our current administration, by the way, we can't officially pull out of Paris until 2020. But yeah, so even if the international talks stall and national talks stall, we don't have much progress, it's at the cities and the subnational levels that people are racing forward. Like Jerry Brown has organized the R20, regional, subnational regions, moving forward on a low carbon economy. C40 cities, Michael Bloomberg and others, cities are moving forward. So it's time to really pivot to local leadership. And I'd say we need to be vigilant and have concern at the national level, but not get too hung up and realize that the rest of even industry is moving forward to a low-carbon economy. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Patz and Mark for the great discussion.
All right, well, thanks for sticking around for the second part of our program this afternoon. I'm Greg Borowski, the Deputy Editor for News, Projects, and Investigations at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. One of my favorite parts of the job is working on the O'Brien Project every year because it's always so ambitious and important, but also because I get to work with some, the top young journalists coming up in the profession, and then hopefully help them all get jobs once they're done. The role of the Journal-Sentinel, for those who aren't familiar with the project, is for all the years that this has been going on, we've had one of the seats in the fellowship, but we also try to work with all of the other visiting fellows. We've had cases where we've collaborated with them, co-published work. Sometimes it just amounts to, hey, we need some photos taken in Milwaukee and we're based in Arizona. Can you help us? It's an opportunity, even as minimal it seems, but it's important for the journalists to come and hang out in the newsroom, meet a whole new community of journalists. If it gets too quiet over here on campus in the world of academia, they get to come and hear phones slam and people yell a little bit, and the newsroom environment that they fell in love with back when they got into the profession. My job this afternoon is to first introduce this panel and then help ask them some questions and take some questions from the audience. These are the people behind these great stories from this year, and it's a chance to sort of pull the curtain back a little bit on how the journalism gets done, and we'll hopefully have some good war stories. And there was a group hug going on here virtually before with Ryan when they all saw him on the screen, so you can tell that they certainly bonded over the course of their work. So let me start with introductions on the very far end. Over here, you all are familiar with Mark Johnson, who we just heard. Mark Hoffman, next to him, is a photojournalist at the Journal-Sentinel, where he's worked for the last 20-plus years. Before that, he's worked at the Associated Press, the Connecticut Post, and the La Crosse Tribune. And I'll tell you, he and Mark have often worked together on projects, and I like it as an editor because it gives me an out. So if I'm ever caught in my desk going, God, what was Mark thinking? This is ridiculous. I just don't understand it. And then one of them walks in. I'm like, oh, it's the other Mark. Don't worry about it. It's always the other Mark. Okay, next to Mark Hoffman is Davy Shastri, who is a graduate of the program from the spring. She spent the summer as the O'Brien intern in our newsroom. She is a newly minted full-time employee starting soon at the Oshkosh Northwestern. I've known Davy, I think, since she was a freshman, and I remember speaking to a freshman class, and she came up to me afterwards, and one of the first things out of her mouth was, do you know Mark Johnson? And I'm like, well, yeah, I know Mark Johnson. And she's like, I would really love to meet Mark Johnson. I'm like, okay, it's really not as exciting as it sounds. He's just a guy, But over the years, I've watched Davy kind of work her way up through student media, and when you look at her background with a biomedical engineering degree and a journalism major, and you realize she's just a lot smarter than you. I figured we'd get her working with Mark, and that was a great payoff for us. McKenna Oxenden here on the end is a senior journalism major from Baltimore, Maryland. She's in the midst of her second O'Brien project, so we didn't scare her off with the first one, which is good. She's working with Aaron Richards on her project this year, and she has the distinguishing factor, I guess, is she had to wait the longest to see her story in print with Mark. It just ran this past Sunday, and she worked on a great story about math and algorithms with Mark. And I'm tempted to have her draw an algorithm on the board, but they didn't leave us a board. I'm also hoping that someday I'm in journalism long enough that McKenna can introduce me to some event, because it's like, it makes you sound really cool. All right, and on the big screens on both sides, Ryan, don't ignore the fact that you're like mega life size here for us. He's coming to us from Wyoming, where he's a reporter at the Sheridan Press, and he graduated back in 2017, back in May. And wave to us, Ryan, so we can all see you. I know you're hearing us, all right? Okay, so we're gonna get started with some questions, and I thought one way to just to start with is just to look at the way that Mark Johnson worked it out was when each of the students end up working very strongly on a specific story or specific angle with them, rather than all the students working on every piece of it. They took a real focused approach. So one of the first stories But the first story out of the gate was one Mark referenced earlier, I think, on Mahal, the orangutan at the Milwaukee County Zoo, and how he had died, and they found out it wasn't, just some fluke of nature, but that he had a tapeworm that was a newly found tapeworm that wasn't from the Milwaukee area and so forth. So that was Mark's kind of kicked it off with this story that gave us a sense of, how these seemingly remote issues are really nearby and close issues. One of the next stories was the two Marks went to Kenya and to Nairobi, Kenya, and Uganda. They wrote about the urban areas and some of the problems with sanitation and other issues there, and how they gathered that. And then we had a story where Ryan was involved. So we're going to ask Ryan the first question or two just to lay us out, where he got to go to Brazil, which is probably pretty cool. But I want you to tell us first, Ryan, about tell us, because this is one of the little quirky war stories you wouldn't hear otherwise, but when you guys were getting your passports, I understand it was a pretty smooth process, right? Can you give us a sense of what it took to get you guys to Brazil? And then we'll talk about the reporting there, but go ahead on the first part.
Sure. Yeah. Even now I still can't quite believe that that I was able to go to Brazil for a week. But I remember specifically we almost didn't make it in time. Me, Mark Johnson, and Mark Hoffman had taken a train down to Chicago because we had to visit the Brazilian consulate, I believe, to apply for our passports and everything. And I somehow had a wrong photo, or it wasn't exactly correct. So we were sprinting all around, running all around, going back and forth, literally running through downtown Chicago because the consulate closed at noon, I think. And I'm sprinting up there waiting for the elevator. I think I made it at about 11:57 a.m. And it was like the last day, just in the nick of time to make it, or else, all of our plans could have been ruined. So it was quite the interesting start for sure. But the overall experience was pretty great.
Yeah, so we wanted to give them a real experience on deadlines and the significance of deadlines and what would happen if you missed your deadline and all that. And he passed that, so then we said, okay, then you can actually go to Brazil with Mark and Mark. But tell us a little bit about that experience, reporting in a foreign country, and maybe what you picked up down there that you may have adapted or how that's helped you in your current job.
Yeah, it was way different for sure. Flying into Rio and driving to our hotel, seeing the city and everything. It didn't quite seem real at first, but yeah, we did a lot of traveling. Talked with pretty much everyone you could think of all across the spectrum. Health officials, doctors, researchers, but then also people who had gotten yellow fever, or who had family members who had died of it or survived it, way out in the jungle, basically. So we got to see both extremes, and worked with an interpreter who we couldn't have done it without her. But I guess the kind of thing that I most took away from it, I guess, just sort of an empathy for people in all situations, all walks of life. I guess I was able to kind of understand where people are coming from a little better. Talking with someone out in the jungle who barely had a house. But talking with them and kind of understanding what it was like to be like them just gave me a better understanding to be able to approach people, be able to connect with people, I guess, at a certain level, which I think is a pretty huge part of being a reporter and journalist is making that connection, at least a little bit.
Let me ask the two Marks about that trip and just how, because I think it's not like you just say, hey, we're going to go to Brazil and report this story. So talk a little bit about maybe Mark Hoffman first and then Mark Johnson about what it takes to even just get a trip like that on the books and plot it out so that you can come back in a week with the stories and things you came back with.
Well, the key thing for us is really preparation. So as Ryan talked about, one of the most important things when you're doing international work is having a fixer or a translator. And without our fixer in Brazil, her name was Nanda. She was great. We really relied on her a lot. We didn't speak Portuguese. She did. And for instance, our plane, we missed a whole day of reporting. We connected on our flight on the way down. We had everything tightly scheduled. You know, we made her find a mother. We said we really need to find someone who's been affected by the Zika virus. And she found this great story about a woman who decided to carry her child to term, and her husband left her because he didn't want to take care of a Zika baby. So the fixers are really worth their weight in gold. I just can't emphasize that enough. I mean, a lot of the credit to the story would go to her because, you know, just logistically to get from one place to the other, we couldn't have done it without her. And actually the same thing goes for Africa. We had a translator and a driver there who we relied on a lot as well. So yeah, fixers are worth their weight in gold by far. But the big thing was we had a week to do it. So you're parachuting in someone's life and you're trying to get instant rapport with them. And as a photographer, that's really hard. And I'm sure for Mark it was pretty hard as well. So you can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, Mark's absolutely right that the translator fixer was just completely invaluable. I mean, we would not have been able to get the story without her. And at the very beginning, I think for about 3 weeks, she and I emailed like almost every day, and I was saying I would think of all these elements that the story needs. I mean, as it went along, I realized, you know, in that 1 week, ideally I wanted to be able to get a chronology to tell each part of the story of yellow fever from the very first monkey that got sick and died to where we were now, where it was spreading to, it was getting closer and closer to Rio. I think it eventually got within 35 miles or 37 miles of Rio. And the amazing thing about it was, I mean, I kept telling her things, and just as a contrast, I had tried to arrange some of these things by myself for probably a good couple of weeks before we hired her, and I was getting nowhere. I mean, I was sending, you know, frantic emails in English, and getting very polite, you know, responses like, I don't know how we're going to be able to help you. But by the time that we actually got to Brazil, she had interviews set up with the very first doctor who treated a yellow fever patient and basically was the first person to diagnose the outbreak, to say that this is going on. We had, she found us a farm where they'd had dead monkeys, where all the elements of the story that we felt needed to go together. We had this sort of quasi-government agency that had been looking into all the different various causes, you know, or possible causes of the outbreak. Because it wasn't, although it didn't become a huge story in the US, I mean, I think other than the New York Times and the Washington Post, I don't think too many places wrote about the yellow fever outbreak, but it was their worst on record since they've been, you know, having records. And she basically set us up with every kind of person that we asked for.
All right, let's talk a little bit now. We're going to pull Davey into the conversation because she got to go to Miami twice, right? Well, Miami and then Key West. This is pre-Hurricane Key West, so it's more fun than it might be to go today. But talk a little bit, if you could, about that story, but also what, you know, I know you went last year to Flint when you were working with Miranda Spivak on her project, but when we're in these conversations, we say, you know, we need to send someone to Miami, and it's really busy, and Mark's busy here. When did it kind of dawn on you that we were wanting to send you to Miami?
Wait, what was the last part?
Well, when did it dawn? How did you feel when you sort of maybe realized, yeah, I'm going to Miami by myself to chase the story?
So I don't know how I always end up in this situation where everyone's like sitting around a table and they're like, who do we send? And they're like, that one. So I ended up going. And I had the experience, like you mentioned, of going to Flint and reporting on the lead crisis there. And just because I already had that under my belt, what happened was Miami ended up needing to happen very quickly. The turnaround was maybe like 2 weeks when we were like, we really need to get a ticket like to get to Miami. And I ended up going over spring break, which everyone thought was hilarious. But I was well behaved. And
you were only there for how many days?
I was there for 3 days.
She had, how many interviews did you have during that time?
I think I had like 7 or 8, maybe.
I mean, they were very full days.
Yeah, yeah.
And she even managed to get kicked out of, what was it, the Customs and Border Patrol?
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So Miami was very rough. I think my second time around, the second time doing anything, like you kind of think like, oh, I got this. And you really don't because it's only your second time. But what ended up happening was while discussing the story about, so our third story in the series looked at third world cities, cities in developing countries, and this idea that it's easy to look at those cities, places like Nairobi, and say, the disease threat there is obvious. It's harder to look at a US city and say the same thing because in a lot of ways it's not comparable, but in many other ways it is still a threat. And so the challenge for us was, where do we find a realistic and fair example in the US? And so the 2 places we were looking at was Miami and New York, right? Yeah.
I think we'd also looked at possibly Texas.
Yeah, and so we were looking at places where the animals were interacting with people in unexpected and new ways due to urbanization, which is obviously a growing trend as we all move out of rural areas and move into the city. And so the Zika outbreak had just happened in Miami, and so that was our obvious go-to. And then it was very quick, it dawned on me that I have to go, and then I had a week, and then I was like, all right, I'm gonna go through everything that's ever been reported on this, I'm gonna find all my sources, line up everything, and then just have everything set up when I go to Miami. So I ended up going to Miami, and then I ended up going to Key West, which, should I hold off on that?
Just describe that one.
Yeah, so Key West was later in the series. That was our 4th story, right? Yeah, and that story looked at kind of the challenges of
man versus mosquito.
Yeah, the challenges of curbing the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carries Zika and dengue and chikungunya and all these scary diseases, but also my story in going to Key West was looking at more of the political side of it. And so I ended up going there for 4 days. And one of those days was traveling, but I ended up doing 15 interviews in 3 days. And I drove over 400 miles because you can't get to the Florida Keys really any other way other than driving from Miami. And that was looking at this controversy that Key West had proposed a trial of genetically modified Aedes aegypti mosquito to release and curb the current population. And it's a new technology that has been tried a couple other times around the world. And what my sidebar to Mark's main bar was looking at was how you convince a wary public of a new technology.
This would have been the very first time that a genetically modified mosquito had been used in the U.S., and it proved very, very controversial.
Yeah, and they put it up for public referendum. It was a non-binding referendum, but they wanted to gauge what the public was thinking about a test, and so it was a very, very interesting case study into some of the issues beyond science. It's hard enough for scientists to figure out how do we control Aedes aegypti, and then when you come up with something that looks promising but still needs to be tested because that's how science works, how do we convince and communicate that complicated information to the public?
All right, so I can say as an editor, when you're working with students, one of my mantras is kind of trust but verify. Okay, so I'm like, Davey's planning a trip, and I just said, let me just send her a note and say, how's it going? What have you got lined up? And I got back, it had to be like 5 minutes later, this minute by minute, moment by moment breakdown of what routes she's taking to get where, who she's talking to at what time. And she says, the response says, what do you think of that? And I'm like, my first thought was, well, plot in some bathroom breaks or something. You're there for a week, right? But no, she did great on that. Tell us just the little footnote on, because you don't speak Spanish.
No.
Right. Who was your translator?
Oh, this was fantastic. Okay, so when I went to Miami, I spoke with, so each situation, each trip required speaking with people who are members of the general public involved in these issues, and then researchers who are in the hotbeds of these issues. And so when I went to cover Zika, I spoke to two mothers who were expecting during the Zika outbreak. One contracted Zika and the other did not. And the one who did contract Zika and made a lot of headlines when she did only spoke Spanish. And so I was like, I have basic high school Spanish. I wish I could translate, but I can't. And so Mark, someone at the Miami Herald, right? You
right.
Had a connection?
Actually, Jill Williams at our paper, who's the features editor, knew somebody at the Miami Herald who was I caught her, I think, about 3 days before she left the Herald to the New York Times.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that she knew a former editor at the Herald who was just a terrific, reporter and Spanish and English speaker, bilingual.
And we were worried because we were like, wow, we're really pushing the budget here. Like, where are we going to get the money for this? And how much is it going to cost? We need to map it all out. And so Mark sent an email and said, hey, this person from Marquette University is showing up in Miami. She's a student. Can you help her? And he responds back, happy to help. And also a proud Marquette alum, so I'll do it free of charge. He said, I'll do it pro bono. And so I got to meet that Marquette alum, and he got to reminisce about Marquette, and he helped me out. And it was a unique experience because he is an award-winning journalist, very good at what he does, which I didn't fully realize when I showed up there to meet him, and I got out of the car with this giant backpack and all this stuff, and he's like, you look like a journalist. And so we go in, and I'm asking all these questions, and he didn't say a single thing. And my photographer, we had a freelance photographer, mentioned later on, he's like, that guy's a real big shot, and it's interesting that he didn't make any comments on what you were saying.
It's Juan Tamayo,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, Juan
Who's
Tamayo.
a Pulitzer Prize winner, I believe. So that's how we roll. We get Pulitzer people to just be our translators on these trips, through the Brien conference. All right, let's go to McKenna here, who did not get to go to Brazil, did not get to go to Miami. She got to stay here in Wisconsin and work on math. So the first question is, how much do you hate your fellow students who got to go on these cool things when you didn't?
Careful.
But more, a lot, a little. Give us a rating.
Definitely a little bitter.
Okay, she's
They got to go to warm places. They got to go across, to all these cool places.
She got to go to 4th and State Street to come to our office a couple times.
Right, and I just stayed in Johnston Hall in a room with no windows.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll all remember that when we're trying to hire McKenna in the spring because she didn't get to go to these fun places, but did great work. So tell us a little bit about your story. This was the one that ran just the other day, and it's really one of the key stories, I think, in the whole project, because when Mark Johnson pitched it to the O'Brien board, it wasn't just, hey, let's write about these diseases. It was, what if we could, in the future, predict these outbreaks before they happen? And everyone around the table was kind of like, really? Is that a real thing? Can it happen? And this is the story that had to show that it was an actual real thing and that it could happen. So tell us a little bit about that story and your work on it.
So Mark was really great in the way that he kind of set it up, like Greg talked about a little bit earlier, that he kind of just came up with these story ideas and was kind of like, all right, everybody pick and choose on what you're interested in. And I sat there and I kind of looked at the stories and I was like, I don't know, for some weird reason I'm kind of drawn to this algorithm story, which is really strange because I really, really hate math. And I just kind of looked at it and I was like, this would be kind of fun to push myself outside my comfort zone. So I decided to, I was like, all right, I can do this. And Mark was like, great, all right. And he's like, how do you feel about, tackling to figure out what an algorithm is, and how to tell our audience what it is? And I said, sure, okay, whatever you say, you're the boss. And so I talked a lot with different researchers that were working in the field to figure out, how they collect data, how they use their data. And then, of course, we talked a lot with a lot of scientists and researchers of is this even possible to use mathematic algorithms to predict future outbreaks? And I think one of the best analogies that we kind of got is the same way that, being able to predict hurricanes and tsunamis and, snowstorms and things like that, that's uses algorithms. So, once upon a time that didn't exist, but now it does. So the idea of being able to predict, infectious disease outbreaks is entirely possible. We had a few negative Nancys and, people from the other side that were like, I think this is kind of not entirely true. But I think it's kind of safe to say that for the most part that, within the next several years, it's something that's going to be prominent and we're going to see, and there's a lot of really, really great work being done to try and do this, because the point is that, we know these diseases exist, so why are they happening when we know that we can try and prevent it and prepare people?
Do you remember what the first step we took was? We went to a math prof here at Marquette to have him explain to us what algorithms are and how they are used for things, because I was actually counting on you, McKenna, to be the good one in math, because basically I didn't take a math course in college. And
yeah, I barely passed statistics, so that was a wrong assumption.
So many of you may be aware that the stereotype of journalists is, well, they're in writing and words because they're no good at math. So first, McKenna's put that to rest. So she should have no trouble getting hired. She ought to just be able to say, look, I did the math story. And if that's one of the questions, like, no, I did the math story, okay? But I have one specific question for McKenna, since she's good at math. We've just established that, right? Okay. So if two journalists get the same assignment while traveling in opposite directions, and they're both 50 miles away from their newsroom, one has drinking a cup of caffeinated coffee and one decaffeinated coffee, which one gets their story filed first?
It depends. Are we driving in a normal car, or are we driving in a Mark Johnson car that has bungee cords that close the door?
Okay. That's actually the correct answer. See, she got that one. All right. So we've heard about the different parts of the project. I want to take a few minutes to focus on the students, but also get some input from the two Marks on how they did. But I want to start with get Ryan back into the conversation here of, okay, and realizing for Ryan, so you can tell there's just like 1,000 people in this room, and they all, everyone I said your name, they all leaned forward in their seats, so they're waiting for your response. But many of them are students, and give us a sense, you're a student, you're a senior at that point, a junior, I guess, when you applied to be in the program, but you meet Mark Johnson, Pulitzer Prize winner, you got this massive project coming, how does that feel? How do you react to that? How do you sort of get yourself in the place that you're going to be able to be a real contributor to something like this?
Yeah, I was really excited initially. Then
you learn more.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was really excited to work with Mark. Did some research on him. Obviously, super accomplished journalist. I did kind of, I didn't really have much of a science background at all. I took biology for non-science majors, and that was about it. So I did like a fair amount of just general science reading before actually meeting Mark, just to try to get familiar with what we might be doing. But then once I actually met him, it was really cool. Just kind of how Mark treated me as an equal, I guess. Was always wanting to bounce ideas, or get my input, stuff like that. Initially, it was a lot of research, reading these pretty dense scientific papers, trying to go over them, just looking for interesting nuggets or possible expert sources to talk to, and then reaching out to those sources. So that was kind of what I thought most of my time would be, just background research, the occasional interview, transcribing a lot of interviews, which is stuff that I did, but I also did a lot more. Mark and I had dual interviews, either that he had set up or that I had worked out, and then obviously going to Brazil was the main thing, and I really just learned a ton from Mark on how to, I guess, the types of questions to ask, and how to approach people. I'm still trying to catch up with Mark for his note-taking ability. Yeah, I don't know. I learned a lot. I'm not sure if that's. I hope that specifically answered your question.
All right, let me ask both Marks, but Mark Johnson first in particular. So, in a newsroom, often we get requests, hey, someone wants to come job shadow and meet, and it's sort of like, oh, I'm not really doing anything exciting today, but I suppose I can entertain a person for an hour or whatever. Now, Mark, where you're working with these students for the whole academic year, what was your take on, how did you determine how much you could give to them and how much they could do, and did you have any trepidation at the start, too, of what will the students be able to do?
I hadn't worked with students on a project before, but I think I very quickly came to the conclusion that, and I've always thought this about journalism, that it's not so much, how many courses you've taken or your even your talent. I think it's your desire. And one of the things that Ryan's probably forgot this, but I got an email from him during Christmas break because he'd spotted an article in the New Yorker about gene drives. You got to it before I did, and he correctly saw that it would be something that we would want to write about, and we did. And I mean, before this year, you ever heard of gene drives? Probably.
Yeah, I'm not sure who he's looking at. I think he's looking at Ryan. Ryan probably hasn't heard it. I'm gonna venture you haven't heard of gene drives before that point.
It was a great thing. I mean, each one of the student reporters added something like that. I mean, McKenna came up with an idea that's going to be our next story on airlines and communicable diseases. That was just an idea that she came up with, and it was just right on target because we kept hearing from experts about how this was one of the key changes in sort of our modern world, that diseases can, jump continents, in no time at all. And when I went back and looked, there weren't actually a lot of news or feature stories on that subject. So it was a good pick. And Davey was great because I have to admit I've struggled. I've been a science reporter now for about 8 years, and I still have to really work my way through scientific papers. I mean, there's times where it just feels like my brain is this bicycle and I'm pedaling as fast as I can just to, try to understand it. And so I don't know if you knew what I was doing, but sometimes I would give her a paper that I was reading and I'd say, I'd just like to get your take on it too. And it was a really good way of making sure that I hadn't misunderstood it. So it was, I think they, very quickly I learned that they had a lot to add to the project. And it was, I knew from the start it was going to be much better than anything I could do by myself.
Yeah, next year we're going to name this panel After the Rose, so we can hear what, all the confessions and the problems and what went on. So Mark Hoffman, can you talk a little bit, you got to witness and see Ryan and Mark working together in the field, and what were you expecting? Because you probably haven't been working with student journalists like that either. What were you expecting, and what were they able to deliver?
I'm not used to having, in fact, I rarely take job shadows with me, because most of the time it's like a student says, I have this class project, I might want to be a photojournalist. So I usually don't take those people for job shadows. But so it was real interesting when we met Ryan. He's full of enthusiasm. And one of the things, when we go out on assignments together, whether if I'm just with Mark, or in this case I was with Ryan, we work as a team. Sometimes Mark might be asking a question and I might be thinking a question ahead, or Ryan might be thinking 2 questions ahead, or someone might say, hey, did you notice that over there? We really, the three of us, probably, 1 + 1 + 1 equals, in this case, probably 4. It really helps the outcome. Just having that person taking that step back always, looking at the bigger picture, what's going on. So I thought it was invaluable having Ryan along. And Brazil, I think, was a great trip for everyone, and Ryan was a key part of that trip.
I have to add one thing that, I don't want his professors here to think that we took him to like beaches and it was like super, super fun. I think we were there for like 6 days, and I think we drove over 1,200 miles. Well, you, Mark Hoffman, drove over 1,200 miles, and we kind of rode. And Ryan, for the most part, stayed awake much of the time. He did very, very well. And they were really long days, like 11 and 12
talking to each other
hours.
after the trip, too, which is good. Davey, let me ask you a question okay, so when you begin the same sort of thing at the start of the program, anybody, a reporter, professional, anybody would have sort of, here's, boy, my greatest fear about what this will be and what I think the greatest success will be. So describe those and then tell us sort of where this effort and program fell on that spectrum.
The greatest fear and the greatest hope?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start with the fear. I think the greatest fear is just like not missing out on an opportunity. And I think when and maybe this is just the type of person I am, but hopefully not, because it makes me sound super anxious. But like I felt like I had 4 years here, 2 years in which I qualified to do O'Brien, and 2 years in which I did O'Brien. And I felt like that's like time slipping away. And there's no other, like I've met lots of professional journalists. Like I just email people and just say, can you talk to me? And I've told them about my experiences, and so many of them, almost all of them, have said that they never would have imagined having the experience that I had as an undergraduate through O'Brien. And so my fear was always, will I be able to work well enough with my fellow to get the most out of it? But my hope was always that I would do as much as I could, but also I think going into something like this when you're young and starting out and don't know much about really anything, is that like I had a lot of trust in both of my fellows, both times around. The first year I worked with Miranda Spivak, who was a freelance journalist who used to be an editor and reporter for the Washington Post. She focuses on transparency issues in state and local government. Like these are leaders in our field both times around, and the one thing I knew is that like if I trust them and then also like guide them a little bit, because they're professionals and they haven't been teachers and they don't know necessarily how to work with a student, but tell them what I need, I'll get as much as I can out of it.
All right, and let me ask this question now of McKenna, a slightly different question, then we're going to take some questions from the audience, so start thinking of those. But McKenna, so a lot of the people in the audience are students who we hope will become O'Brien, future research assistants and interns and such. Talk a little bit about what pulled you into the program, what allowed you to be successful, and then give them whatever your top piece of advice is that they need to do besides learn math. Or in Ryan's case, sprint a lot, so you can get your passports. But
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the O'Brien program is unlike anything else literally across the country. I mean, when in your undergrad career are you going to be able to, in most places, work with a professional journalist and have your work be, on a, potentially nationwide level or a wider audience? And, the added fact that, Mark is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and like that could potentially be a once in a lifetime opportunity. You might not ever work with somebody of that caliber again. So coming into it, I remember freshman year in Dr. Gardner's class, she always brings in the O'Brien Fellows to, chat, and I was totally fascinated by everybody's projects. I mean, all the projects are always absolutely dynamite, and, I went up right away to just chat with them and, hear more. And I remember sophomore year, Justin George was from the Baltimore Sun, and being from just outside Baltimore, I was totally bummed that as a sophomore, I wasn't able to do it. So, you see these projects, and I think it's just inspiring of, the journalism that can be done and the journalism that will be done in the future. And in order to get here, if you're serious about journalism and you're serious about working for O'Brien, It's never too early to start laying the groundwork and start whispering into Dave's ear and all the other fellows' ear, hey, I'm really interested in this. You know, and if you're not involved in student media, you should change that. Because newsflash, people and professionals don't want to see your work done in journalism class that's unpublished. They want to see published work. They want to see that you have been writing and writing and writing. And not only that, you know, we have really, you know, great connections. Greg is always constantly, you know, coming in, or we know that he's a phone call or an email away, maybe sometimes much to his dismay, that we can bother him. Of, you know, creating these connections and making sure that if O'Brien is what you want to do, that it's there. You know, I mean, I'd say it's all about paving your own way, taking the bull by the horns, having the initiative to do what you want to do, promote yourself, and, you know, just put yourself out there, which can be sometimes scary, but, you know, you're going to get a huge benefit out of it.
All right, so I'm officially out of material, so I have no more good jokes, but I'm interested in some questions from the audience. And the reminder is you press the little thing on what is officially told, I'm told that the doohickey, and that'll allow it to be allowed. So in the front row all right, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very exciting program, and I've been on the other end of being interviewed a lot. My question to you is, was there one top piece of advice or technique?
Oh, okay, sorry. So being at the other end of being interviewed, was there some best piece of advice or technique, something that you learned that you found to be the most useful in extracting the key information that for many scientists, certainly scientists, can be pretty hard to get? Any secrets that you said, aha, that one really worked, and I didn't know that before?
All right, let's have Davey take that one. We'll try to just have like maybe one or two people answer each so we get through more questions, but Davey, go ahead.
Okay, so to answer this question, I have to go like into before O'Brien a little bit, but I wanted to be a science writer since freshman year when like I was like, who's Mark Johnson? And like freaking out, big fan. So I've been in the middle. I studied biomedical sciences and journalism, did a minor in neuroscience. So one of my profs is right there. So like I learned the science and that was very helpful. But you can't obviously know everything. And so then as I started to write, one of my earlier internships was actually at Science Magazine in DC, which is what publishes the science journals. And what I learned there was that there were a lot of people who had science backgrounds, even up to PhDs, who were science reporters for that journal. And even though they probably knew what was being explained to them, they played dumb. And I think that is the best way to do it. And that took me a long time to master because it's hard to get over your ego and say, like, act like you don't know anything or just admit that you don't know anything. But the best thing for me in terms of interviewing scientists was always to just get them to explain it as much as possible. And then work back through it with them. Because another big challenge is researchers in many cases fear oversimplification of their work because it can come across as inaccurate to their colleagues. And that's not anything we ever intend to do, but if we need to explain something in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel to whoever's picking it up on the street, it needs to be palatable for anyone who doesn't have a science background. And so it's much easier to work through that with your source rather than trying to do it yourself. And I think Mark will probably mention this, but he works back and forth with his sources a lot, especially his key sources, to make sure that everything makes sense but is understandable. So in a lot of situations where it's easy to think of it as a one-sided thing, where it's like, we're the journalists and we need to get the answers, in science reporting, it's definitely two-sided.
Okay, let's try to take a couple more questions. Let's go with Dr. Bob.
Here, there we go. Yeah, Bob Griffin, professor. Oh, two of them. Okay, stereo. Emeritus in the Department of Journalism. I think the Journal-Sentinel better be ready for another Pulitzer based on this series. And if I could award it a special award, I would give it to this article on algorithms and mathematical modeling that just appeared this last Sunday. That was one of the toughest jobs in reporting I could imagine. And it wasn't statistics, it was statistical reasoning and mathematical reasoning that's more important. And it was pulled off extremely well. One thing I'd like to hear, and McKenna talked a little bit about how the idea came about, but it was written so well, and that's also very tough to do. What strategy did you use? How did you put together the structure of that article? Because it really, really came across to folks, I think.
Yeah. Why don't you, McKenna, why don't you go, and then Mark can jump in.
So that's one of the first things Mark and I talked about was like, how are we going to get people to want to read this article? And so, we started talking to people in the field, and many of these people are across the world. So we just kind of sent an initial email with, the basic questions of, who are you? What are you doing? And one of the things we talked about is like, how do you collect your data? And we got the craziest stories from these people. And it was a gold mine. One of the responses, which is what we led with in our lead, was one of the researchers had to participate in a seance and get permission from the dead before she went to go collect data. And participate in a ritual in, I think it was like an African village. Another researcher chased a marabou stork because it had swallowed the bat that she needed to collect a blood sample from. People were in a canoe with no water or electricity for days on end, and just all of these crazy stories. And so it was an incredible testament to like what people go through to get this data to propel the future forward in science and in math and predicting these algorithms. But it was also like, holy cow, we can relate this as to just to make it absolutely interesting for people. And so we knew that was going to be a good chunk of our story, because if trying to talk to the dead doesn't capture your attention, I don't know what will.
Yeah. Mark, go ahead.
The first thing I'd say is that we spent a long time, I think a good month, talking about the lead, because as McKenna said, we didn't know how we were going to make a math story, really interesting. I think that it was one of these cases where you were fighting this idea that it was dull but important, really important. And I mean, my operating theory is that the dull part is only because you're looking at it a certain way. And initially, we were looking at the mathematicians and the people who were developing these algorithms. And I think we had decided, I forget how the idea came about, but we asked one of them, where does the information that you use to build the algorithm, where does it come from? And that's when we got the idea, we got the response that it was from these people in the field who spend sometimes 30 or 40 years, developing an expertise. It's the kind of thing that often it's referred to as sort of basic science, and when I've written about it before in the Journal Sentinel, sometimes I almost always get dispiriting comment to the effect of, well, that's your text always at work or something. And this was a really good chance to show that there, even if knowledge for knowledge's sake isn't good enough, there's actually, to a lot of this work, there's a real payoff. One of the other things that sort of came about, you talked about the structure. Well, the history of it kind of interested me, and for a number of the stories, we tried to sort of work in a history component. And I had no idea, like, how long people had been using mathematics, to look at it as a way to look at and explain and understand infectious diseases. That part was interesting. And then when we actually got into the real weeds of like how does this work? How does it actually crunch out, something useful? To me, that was actually, it was difficult because it was piece by piece kind of understanding, and a lot of the time what happens
Davey mentioned this, is that we write something and it's not quite accurate, or there's something that we haven't quite got right. And I think that that's one of the parts of the process that, in a way, it's endlessly humbling, but it's a good part of the process. I tend to go back and forth with scientists, and on really technical stuff, I'll show them, this is what I'm writing. Is this correct? And sometimes what happens is it's a way that it almost works, I think, like some of those algorithms. It brings you closer and closer to something that's correct. Your mistakes sort of end up teaching you a lot. And it just so happened that we had some really good, we talked to some researchers who did an excellent job of sort of explaining what they do. This was the issue that Dr. Patz brought up. Well, I have one thing for scientists and mathematicians that would be sort of a piece of advice. And it's more something that for a very long time I've sort of carried around this idea that even people who do really, complicated, complex work, it's got to be something I can explain. I mean, I've written one story that was about Mach theta functions. And my theory is that at some point, usually probably Thanksgiving or Christmas, they sit down with their relatives. And Cousin Fred asks, so what have you been working on? And there's got to be a way that you explain it to your family members who aren't experts in math or science. And it's just a matter of starting to think about it that way, almost as if you were having a really nice conversation in a restaurant, and in a way, you're taking somebody who's possibly not interested in something or thinks they're not, and you're sort of showing them that, wow, once you pull the curtain back, it's actually pretty damn interesting.
All right, that may be a good spot to end it, but I think appropriately, because it's kind of a good commercial for an underlining of why the O'Brien program is so important. So in a normal newsroom, if a reporter comes to you and says, hey, I want to do this story about math, and I'm going to spend a month talking about the lead, they're going to be sent right out to the street to get a story more quickly. So what the Brien Fellowship does is it's an incredible blessing in the world of journalism. It gives you that time away. It gives you access to the resources and researchers and professors and people at Marquette, but in other places, it gives you the students to take that project that, Mark couldn't have done. We'll have like 7 or 8 installments of this thing when we're done. He couldn't have done that in a year on his own. He couldn't have done it in 2 or more years probably, but we're able to accelerate it. You give the students the great experience, which we saw, including from Ryan, who so patiently is waiting from Wyoming saying, come on, Greg, get done. I got to go to the bathroom here, right? Okay. All right, so we'll let you off the hook in just a second, but let's say thank you to the panel, and then I think Dave wants to maybe say a few words. So thanks, guys.
Before we say goodnight, I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, all of our guests for the insights and time, and Ryan for being so patient with us. I want to thank the audience, though, first and foremost, because we really appreciate your coming out and supporting this kind of journalism. And we are, in fact, taking this show on the road. The O'Brien Conference will be following its journalists back to their home cities to do public forums. So if you're interested in a group tour, maybe we could get a rate and go to Naples and Minneapolis. But in all seriousness, we hope to see you back here for the 6th conference next year. Thanks a lot.